Welcome back. This segment I want to think about prophets and prophecy in the ancient Near East. So think with me for a few minutes about the larger setting of Israeli prophets and prophecy. Let me remind you of two observations that I've already shared. Do you remember when we discussed the Yamauchi's assertion that only a fraction of 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 everything that's ever been made or written has survived and been discovered and analyzed and published? So we have a lot more hard data on the prophets and prophecy in Mesopotamia and Egypt than we did, say, 100 years ago, but it's still limited. The second reminder is that Israel's not living in a hermetically sealed biosphere. No, they're immersed in their situation in the ancient Near East, right? I mean, socially, economically, culturally, they're in it. And yet, we've seen this tension woven throughout the Hebrew Bible, namely, this expectation that God's people were to be in the world as a channel of blessing and at the same time to be a holy people, set apart to Yahweh. Well, I bring that up now to say that we shouldn't be surprised to find persons functioning as prophets in neighboring cultures. Indeed, we do find texts indicating a prophet's being consulted by the royal about imminent issues. I mean, these kings aren't asking for a forecast untold millennia into the future. The royals were concerned about the intentions of the gods with respect to a particular situation now. I mean, something like an anticipated battle or recovery from drought and famine. Commonly, these sorts of questions were divined by occult means of divination. So, these ancient Near Eastern prophets were trained to divine good omens or bad omens from the liver of a sacrificed animal. So, here's an example of a seminary text for learning extispacy or hepatoscopy, the reading of a liver. It's a clay textbook. And you see the inscribed grid with cuneiform notations talking about the significance of a blemish on this part of the liver or that. Other forms of divination included hydromancy, the reading of the patterns of oil when it was poured on water, or belomancy, the interpretation of the pattern of a spilt quiver of arrows. You have astrology, magic, ecstatic sorcery. Now, the Israelis were aware of these practices. So, for example, the setting here is the Babylonian king is on the march with his armies, and as he approaches the Levant, the question is, do I attack from the west or do I attack from the east? So look at the text. The king of Babylon is standing at a fork in the road. It says at the parting of the ways, at the head of two ways. He's near Damascus. And he uses divination. He wants to know, as I mentioned, whether the gods favor his attacking from the east, in which case he takes the left fork along the king's highway, or to attack from the west, in which case he would take the right fork and go along the way of the sea. So what does the text say? He shakes the arrows, he consults the teraphim, he looks at the liver. You have three examples of ways that the king would ask the prophets to divine whether the gods were looking kindly on this enterprise or not. Now, the Israelis were also aware of the fact that they were expected not to turn to the occult. I mean, if you check back to Exodus 22 or Leviticus 20 or Deuteronomy 13, you see that resorting to the occult was a capital offense. Well, in addition to this sort of divination, there's now evidence of what some call intuitive prophecy. From an 18th century trove of, get over 25,000 clay tablets found at Mari. We have examples like Mari letter A2731, where one Nur Sin admonishes the king, Zimrilim, with a third generation prophecy. So he's writing what the god Ada told the prophets. The god telling the prophets who tell Nur Sin, who's now telling the king, right, what? To do justice. So here are a couple of lines. When a wronged man or woman cries out to you, be there, judge their case. This only have I demanded of you, says Adad. If you do what I've written to you and heed my word, I'll give you the land from the rising of the sun to the setting. So, see, here's a case that seems similar to the moral demands made by the Hebrew prophets. Now, before the mid-1930s, we didn't know of any examples of this kind of intuitive ancient Near Eastern prophetic composition. Well, to my mind, the most significant difference between the biblical and the non-biblical, or even Hebrew false prophets, is the understanding of the deity. You see, in the Middle Eastern texts, the setting is polytheism and animism, but in Israel, the Orthodox view is there's one God who created all and is over all and is seeking a loving covenant relationship with all. You see, there is not in the Middle Eastern texts the level of moral outrage and ethical vehemence that's seen in the Hebrew prophets. Another interesting, although this may be a bit superficial, distinction is that in the ancient Near East text extant, the prophets address only the king. Now, remember the fragmentary nature of evidence that I mentioned. This fact that the prophets only talk to the king may be because the texts we've discovered in the last century were all found where? In the palace archives. So it may be an accident of history. But don't miss the fact that in Israel, the institution of prophet, if I can call it that, stood and confronted not only the royal establishment, but also the religious establishment, the priesthood, and the commercial establishment, the Chamber of Commerce too. So, note well, much of the message of the biblical prophets is to the rank and file of the nation. And that's a huge difference in the biblical text. Think about it. We'll see you in a bit.